Ever heard of a system where you might be represented by a whole group instead of just one person?
Sounds like it could get complicated.
It definitely does, and that's what we're diving into today, the Philippines party list system.
And we're going straight to the source.
Absolutely. Legal documents, court decisions, even debates from when they were putting together the 1987 Philippine Constitution.
We're talking about the nitty-gritty of how this whole thing is supposed to work.
We'll be tackling some legal jargon along the way, but think of it like a really interesting dinner conversation.
No need for law textbooks here.
Definitely not. So let's kick things off with Article 6 of the Philippine Constitution, specifically Section 5. It says the House of Representatives has members elected from Districts A and D, those who shall be elected through a party list system.
Right off the bat, it's clear this is something different.
Totally. But what's the goal here? Why have this party list system in the first place?
Now, this is where things get really interesting. The idea was to go beyond just representing places.
Instead of just your local district, it's about making sure groups across the nation have a say.
Exactly. Think proportional representation, making sure diverse voices are heard.
That makes sense, but Section 5.2 makes things a bit tricky.
How so?
Well, it talks about national, regional, ND, sectoral parties or organizations. That's super broad. Who gets to be on this list? What are the rules?
That question, my friend, has caused some serious legal headaches.
It gets right to the heart of who gets a voice in a democracy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about figuring out whose voices get amplified and how a system balances all these different interests.
It's like figuring out who gets on the lifeboat, but in a political system.
That's a good way to put it.
So as we jump into the thick of it, what were the big arguments about who's in and who's out?
Some folks argued the party list should be only for marginalized and underrepresented groups.
Makes sense, giving a voice to the voiceless.
Exactly. But then others said, hold on, if you exclude established parties, aren't you limiting viewpoints?
So you have to balance things out, ensuring representation for the underrepresented, but not leaving out other voices.
And that's where things get really tricky.
Let's look at some real examples to see how this plays out. The COMELEC, the Commission on Elections, rejected a group called AKB.
What do they represent?
They said they were there for Bicolanos.
Interesting.
But Bicolec already has district representatives, so is that fair to exclude them?
It's a tough one. Sure, Bicolanos have geographical representation, but does that mean all their concerns are being addressed?
Right. Just because you have a voice doesn't mean it's being heard on every issue.
Exactly.
And then there are debates about groups like young professionals. Are they really marginalized?
Or what about groups like environmental enthusiasts? Makes you think who gets to decide who's marginalized enough.
And those decisions have real consequences. We're talking about situations where the COMELEC disqualified entire parties.
Well, because of who they nominated.
Yep. Some nominees didn't fit their definition of marginalized.
Wow. That seems like a lot riding on one person.
One example that really got me thinking was the AAI party. They represented agricultural workers, a group facing some serious challenges. But one of their nominees owned a pineapple plantation.
So someone who's doing well representing those who aren't.
Exactly. Does that one person's success somehow erase the struggles of the entire group? It's a tough question.
For sure. It makes you think about what it really means to represent a group.
And if someone overcomes challenges, does that mean they can't advocate for others who are still facing those same challenges?
It's like you're punished for succeeding.
Right. And to make it even more complicated, there's no clear definition of marginalized and underrepresented.
Yeah, it's pretty vague, both legally and philosophically.
Even the legal experts are wrestling with this. We have Justice Leonin calling out this ambiguity, saying it's not just a legal issue, but a philosophical one. What does it even mean to be marginalized? Who decides?
That's a question that goes way beyond the courtroom.
It makes you wonder, if you were creating a system for fair representation, how would you define these things?
Not an easy task.
Definitely not. And the stakes are high. We're talking about fundamental rights, political participation, the very essence of democracy.
And we've only just scratched the surface. And it's not just a theoretical debate, you know?
Yeah, this ambiguity actually affects how the whole partyless system works.
Absolutely. It has real consequences for the groups who are trying to get represented.
It's like the system meant to help them is also the one that's really vulnerable to legal challenges.
Exactly. And that takes us to another layer of this whole thing. The actual procedures.
Okay, how so?
Did COMELEC even have the right to do all this? Did the parties get a fair shot to defend themselves?
It's like we've stumbled into a legal thriller now. We're talking accusations of bias, questions of due process. It makes you wonder if even systems designed to be fair can actually be flawed.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
It shows why we always need to be paying attention, making sure things are transparent, and that there's accountability in a democracy.
Especially when it comes to who gets a voice and who holds the power, right?
Absolutely. And this is where Justice Leonen's critique becomes really important. He doesn't just point out the vagueness, he offers a possible solution.
And what's that?
He says, instead of getting stuck on defining marginalized, we should look at what a party is actually planning to do to help those groups.
So instead of saying, prove you're marginalized enough, we ask, what's your plan and how will it actually make things better?
Yeah, exactly. It's about taking action, not just fitting into a category.
That's a pretty big shift. It makes me think about how often we get caught up in labels instead of focusing on real change.
Right. And by shifting that focus, we might end up judging parties on their commitment to social justice, not just their members' backgrounds.
So we're looking at what they're actually doing to help, not just who they are.
Precisely. It's about outcomes, not just identities.
This idea of focusing on a party's action plan is really interesting. It makes you think about what it really means to represent the most vulnerable.
It's a huge shift. Imagine a system where parties are judged on their actual track record, what they've achieved, not just who they say they represent.
It would definitely make things more about finding solutions and less about just arguing over definitions.
And hopefully it'd be more effective that way, too.
If the goal is to make things fairer, shouldn't we be focusing on what actually works and what we can measure?
Absolutely. But even if we shift our thinking, some big questions remain.
Questions that go way beyond just the Philippines, right?
Exactly.
This whole deep dive, even though we're focused on one country system, it brings up stuff that every democracy has to deal with.
How do we make sure everyone's voice is heard? How do you balance what individuals need with what's good for everyone? How do you create systems that are fair and actually work? Those are tough questions.
And there are no easy answers. Plus, things are always changing, right? What worked years ago might not work now, and what works in one place might not work in another.
It's a process of constantly learning and adapting and trying to create a better, fairer society.
And a big part of that is having these conversations, even when they're difficult, and being open to new ideas.
We can't just avoid the tough stuff or pretend there's one right answer. We have to be willing to learn from each other and consider different perspectives.
That's one of the best things about these deep dives. It's not just about getting information, it's about finding new ways to think about the world.
And it's about giving people the tools to be more informed, engaged citizens, ready to ask the tough questions.
We've really dug into the Philippines party list system, haven't we?
We have, from its beginnings in the Constitution to those legal battles over who's considered marginalized.
And it's not just a theoretical discussion either.
It's about real people's lives.
Absolutely. It makes you realize how complicated these systems can be.
Full of contradictions, too.
Trying to be fair and representative, but bumping into all these challenges.
And it's something people are grappling with all over the world.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up, what are some big takeaways for our listeners? What matters, even if this system is specific to the Philippines?
I think the biggest thing is to always be questioning how power works, how representation happens.
Right. Like just because someone meant well when they set up a system doesn't mean it'll always work perfectly.
And we saw that even trying to help marginalized groups, you can run into roadblocks.
Exactly. So being willing to adapt, that's huge.
The world's not standing still, right?
What's considered marginalized today, it might be different tomorrow, so the systems have to keep up.
You got to be able to have those hard conversations, too, even when it's uncomfortable.
We can't just ignore the tough stuff or act like there's one easy fix.
And that's where I think Justice Leonen's idea is so interesting, shifting from, are you marginalized enough, to, what's your plan?
It's about action, right? Not just labels.
That's it. Hold people accountable for what they're going to do, not just who they are.
It's about making a real difference.
Exactly. And that's important everywhere, not just in politics.
It really is. Well, on that note, we'll leave everyone with this. How can you take this action-oriented thinking into your own life?
Whether it's in your community, at work, wherever.
Challenging what's unfair, speaking up for people who aren't being heard.
Asking those tough questions about how decisions are made. Who has the power?
We all have a part to play in making the world a bit more just, a bit more equitable.
It's a journey, that's for sure.
Learning, thinking critically, getting involved.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Keep those conversations going.